I imagine, if we're honest, we all have memories of the past that bring a sting of shame and remorse as we face aspects of ourselves at different ages that we would rather leave firmly in the past. One of these shameful periods for me is from my high school days in the mostly white Church of England school in St Albans, just outside London, with its 11th century Hogwarts-like stone spiral staircases. It's the strong memory of telling and laughing at very racist jokes. I recall most of these jokes being aimed at the Pakistani population, and I remember thinking they were hilarious. Just a few weeks ago, I was thinking back to how funny I found those outrageously offensive jokes, when out of the blue I got a WhatsApp message from Roy Head, who was the head boy in my final year at school, gown and all. He told me that he'd recently remembered that when I came back from a weekend away with my Jewish youth group, I started telling everyone that it really wasn't okay to tell racist jokes anymore. I was probably 14 or 15 at the time, and I'd forgotten that part of the story, but I pieced it together and started recalling a very powerful weekend with what was then called Alpsnik, the Union of Liberal and Progressive Synagogues Network of Youth Clubs, where we discussed events leading up to the Holocaust and the danger of racial and cultural stereotypes. It obviously had a huge impact on me, and I was glad for Roy's recollection that I called us all out for this troubling behavior. Of course, that was 40 years ago, and I cannot possibly claim that this was the end of any racist thought or act on my part, or the last time I was complicit in supporting racist institutions. But it was perhaps the beginning of my awareness of the need to stand up and to name something for what it is. Ibram X. Kendi, author of the brilliant book How to Be an Anti-Racist, says, "The heartbeat of racism is denial. The heartbeat of anti-racism is confession." The heartbeat of racism is denial. The heartbeat of anti-racism is confession. Confession, vidui. Confession, vidui, which lies at the heart of our Yom Kippur liturgy and ritual as we acknowledge, take account, and confess our sins. So here I am, reliving a shameful memory and confessing my own racism and my commitment to do more in the wake of the endless stream of violence and murder of black people. The horror of the police killing of George Floyd, even though not new nor surprising, pushed many of us out of silence and out of complacency. I have read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. I've seen the dungeons of the slave castle on Cape Coast in Ghana, where thousands of slaves were chained naked before being sent on ships to the Americas. I've been to the Legacy Museum, from slavery to mass incarceration, built in a former slave warehouse in Montgomery, Alabama. And I've been to the National Peace and Justice Memorial up the street that memorializes the more than 4,400 lynchings of black people in 800 counties across the United States between 1877 and 1950. I've been moved to tears by so much of what I have seen and what I have read. And yet, as Kendi defines it, that does not make me an anti-racist. In July, when I was in the Boston area, I went for a lovely walk in the famous Arboretum in Jamaica Plain with Yotam Schachter, Reb Zalman's youngest son, who grew up here in Boulder. We started talking about racism, and we discussed the books that we'd read, when Yotam shared with me a dream that he had had of his Abba, our teacher, Reb Zalman, who Yotam said did not often appear to him. Yotam was wrestling, as we all are or should be, about how far we still are from MLK's dream. In Yotam's dream, Reb Zalman told him, it's not about education, it's about teshuvah. It's not about education, it's about teshuvah. Yes, there is so much collective teshuvah, repentance that we need to do. The Jewish community has been far from immune to the disease of racism, even though our tradition demands that we see every human being as a reflection of the divine image, deserving dignity and respect. And even though the Torah cries out, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdof, justice, justice you will pursue. And this verse we have been hearing was the verse framed in the office of the greatly mourned Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it's the backdrop of the new sign that we have outside Bonai Shalom's building. Education is important, but it's not enough. James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. If we pretend otherwise, we literally are criminals. We are our history. We carry it with us. We have to learn our history. It's absurd to claim that it's unpatriotic to learn the history of slavery, oppression, segregation, mass incarceration, and that history curricula should only contain positive narratives of the land of the free, when so many have never really been free. Teshuvah and action come from our commitment to learn and to teach the shadows of our past. We're very grateful that Bonai is one of the recipients of the Jabba, Jewish and Black Alliance book collection, with many of the books that I mentioned earlier available to borrow with the intention of creating read and act groups. Jabba donated more than 40 books to the JCC across the street, and that collection is also available for lending. And we're also supporting Good Trouble for Kids, a collaborative arts initiative to promote racially conscious reading for kids of all ages. Jabba was always meant to go beyond education. It was meant to promote donations to racial justice causes and opportunities for people to take personal and political measures against racism. Good Trouble for Kids is driven by a desire to change the canon, to support black-owned businesses and authors, and to allow black, indigenous, and children of color to see themselves and their lives realistically reflected in the literature that they read, a much-needed corrective. Both of these projects have been created by people here, people that we know in our community. But as the founders of these organizations insist, art and activism must go hand in hand. Education must lead to action. So let's begin with defining some terms, as Kendi does. Kendi speaks of segregationists, assimilationists, and anti-racists. Most of us are probably assimilationists, with assertions like, we had a black president in the White House for 8 years, how can we be racist? Or maybe we claim to be colorblind, believing that in this land of opportunity, people have to get themselves out of the ghetto and make the most of their lives since anyone can overcome their circumstances. Kendi says, the colorblind individual, by ostensibly failing to see race, fails to see racism and falls into racist passivity. Kendi clearly rejects colorblindness in favor of anti-racism. There is no middle ground, according to him. He says one either allows racial inequalities to persevere as a racist or confronts inequalities as an anti-racist. What side of history will we stand on, he asks. A racist is someone who is supporting a racist policy by their action or inaction, or by supporting a racist idea. In Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, Americans believe in the reality of race as a defined, indubitable feature of the natural world. Racism, the need to ascribe bone-deep features to people and then humiliate, reduce, and destroy them inevitably follows from this inalterable condition. In this way, racism is rendered as the innocent daughter of Mother Nature. He continues, but race is the child of racism, not the father. I'd always assumed that racist theories and ideas led to racist policies and actions, but after reading both Kendi and Coates, I see clearly that it's the other way around. Racist policies were created to protect white wealth and white power, and these policies birthed the dehumanizing racist ideas. The source of racist ideas was not ignorance and hate, but self-interest, says Kendi. The history of racist ideas is the history of powerful policymakers, he says. And Coates adds, you have to make peace with the chaos, but you cannot lie. You cannot forget how much they took from us and how they transfigured our very bodies into sugar, tobacco, cotton, and gold. And he elaborates, the richest men in America lived in the Mississippi River Valley, and they made their riches off our stolen bodies. Some of you may be very uncomfortable right now, maybe even angry or defensive, wondering why I'm talking about this on the holiest day of the year, perhaps protesting that I'm being too political. And it's Yom Kippur. My friend, Reverend Pedro Silva, an African-American pastor at First Congregational Church here in downtown Boulder, recently shared with me his own thoughts on this. He said, talking about race isn't political, it's personal. He said, because it helps us understand how we deal with other people. It's about consciousness and about putting your highest ideals into practice. It is a chance for us to bear witness to how we show up in the world and deepen our relationships with others and with God through encounter. That's what Yom Kippur is at its core. It's a powerful day to deepen and heal our relationships. And part of that is our willingness to get beyond the white fragility that protests and protects and defends. We must be willing to be vulnerable and fess up to the fact that our white privilege has been built on broken backs. We must be willing to acknowledge that white supremacy is alive and well in our culture, and that racism is systemic in many of our institutions. An astonishing 60% of black men who drop out of school will end up in jail. The justice system in so many states works against rather than for people of color. And according to U.S. Library of Medicine Review, a black person is 2.8 times more likely to die in police custody than a white person. People of color have had knees on their necks for centuries. The horrific footage of a white police officer's knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 48 seconds, literally squeezing out his life, is not the first incident of police brutality, nor, and I say this with despair, is it likely to be the last. The despicable racist assault that happened in downtown Boulder to our own executive director, Stacey Aviva Flint, and her daughter should appall us. And yet, and perhaps this will shock some of you, it is only one of many racist incidents in our city. Boulder is far from immune. I'm speaking about this today because I have to. Because I'm compelled in my role as a rabbi and as a Jew in pursuing the call of tzedek, tirdof. I believe that in this deeply racially charged moment, we must listen, learn, confess, and act. Earlier this month, Rabbi Jacob Blumenthal, who is the CEO of USCJ, of the United Synagogues of Conservative Judaism, sent a letter to constituents explaining the USCJ's decision to be a signatory to a letter signed by over 600 Jewish organizations across the denominations that was published in the New York Times on the last Friday in August, with its fervent message that Black lives matter. Rabbi Blumenthal asserts that the statement represents the mainstream point of view in the Jewish community. And toward the end of the letter, he says, there may be times when we need to take a step back from the Jewish community's immediate concerns, and when we see fatal results of prejudice and systemic racism, give priority to those efforts. As we form closer alliances, we will also find opportunities to talk about our own concerns. The letter concludes, Jewish tradition at this time of year requires that we look at both ourselves and our society, our own challenges, biases, and imperfections, and act to correct them. George Floyd's name joined with Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Walter Scott, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Stephon Clark, Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor, shot in her own home by police officers, none of whom were charged for her death by the grand jury in Louisville, Kentucky last week. Elijah McClain, from here in Aurora, a massage therapist who played the violin to stray cats to soothe them. And so many more men and women killed by police, as well as Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, and all of those whose innocent lives were taken by civilians. Say their names. Say their names. In some agonizing way, these black lives, these black bodies did not matter. In the aftermath of George Floyd's death, Bonai Shalom members and friends came together to form a response to racism group. We decided we could no longer be bystanders and we needed to act. Under Barbara Traeger's leadership, this committee hosted a Show Up and Listen event, which Michelle Goldman talked about last night in her wonderful Kol Nidre appeal, Show and listen, show up and listen. It was a very moving account, personal stories about the impact of racism and being the parent of black and brown children living in that fear for their lives. The group also got board approval for a statement on our website and the hanging of the banner on the east side of our building. Tzedek, Tzedek Tirdof, Black Lives Matter, Justice, Justice you shall pursue. Other projects in the works include organizing a book discussion on how to be an anti-racist in early November, along with partnerships with JABA, Good Travel for Kids, and there will be other actions and ways to get involved in collective anti-racist work at Bonai as a community and as individuals. Personally, I became a lifelong member of our local NAACP chapter and I'm on their Religious Affairs Committee, assisting in planning some interfaith events, programs, and spiritual support for victims of racism. I know that some of you cannot let go of your issues with Black Lives Matter as a movement, seeing it as problematic and charged and even anti-Semitic because of its 2016 platform on BDS. But Black Lives Matter, as Stacey has taught us, is not a monolithic organization. Black Lives Matter is a value statement about people far more than it is any one organization that may or may not have principles that we cannot embrace in their entirety. Black Lives Matter is about humanity, about dignity and justice for a people who have suffered intolerable amounts of indignity, brutality, injustice, and dehumanization. Black Lives Matter is the largest civil rights movement in history. It's a very diverse community of people prepared to stand up in a world where again and again and again black and brown bodies are killed by forces that are meant to protect them. Yes, there's been some violence and destruction to property at some of the protests, but to dismiss everyone who is involved in this movement as members of a destructive mob or to label them domestic terrorists is absurd and offensive. Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a deeply spiritual day, joyful even. But if we're really doing the hard work that the day demands, it is also uncomfortable. We must confront the painful reality of our lives and of our world. In 1962, James Baldwin said, "People find it difficult to act on what they know. To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. In this case," he says, "the danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity." Many of us and our families for generations have integrated into the prosperity of the American dream. This is not to deny the complexity of our Jewish identity, nor the fact that as Jews, of course, we have been the targets of appalling hate crimes. But far too many Americans have been excluded from the American dream altogether. In Between the World and Me, Coates writes, "The dream is tree houses and Cub Scouts, The dream smells like peppermint but tastes like strawberry shortcake. And for so long I have wanted to escape into the dream, to fold my country over my head like a blanket. But this has never been an option because the dream rests on our backs, the bedding made from our bodies. Last year at Rosh Hashanah, when the world felt so very different, my colleague Rabbi Sharon Brous of Ikar in Los Angeles delivered a searing sermon, later condensed and published in the LA Times, calling for Jewish support for reparations to Black Americans. She taught a famous Talmudic teaching in which the schools of Hillel and Shammai dispute the method of making restitution when a stolen beam is built into the foundation of a house or even a beautiful palace. Both agree that restitution must be made. Shammai argues we must tear down the house to retrieve the beam and return it to its rightful owner. You can't build something beautiful on a lie. But Hillel has a different take. What sense does it make to demolish the palace? Let the thief pay for the beam, considering its full value as the foundation of a beautiful home. Rabbi Brous said passionately in that sermon, our country was built on a stolen beam, except it was several million stolen beams, and they weren't beams, they were human beings. In 2018, Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein, a Chicago teacher and activist, wrote an incredibly in-depth and compelling article on the Torah's case for reparations, 2.5 years after Ta-Nehisi Coates' Case for Reparations article was published in The Atlantic. Rabbi Bernstein wrote, our ancestors were rescued from slavery with reparations bountiful enough to build long-term financial security. Our free society is commanded to ensure the same for those plunged into economic subordination so that temporary poorness never becomes structural poverty. Rabbi Bernstein concludes that long article, when people talk about reparations today, they mean targeted programs overseen by governmental commissions. Various models have been proposed and implemented in different places. They should be studied, selected, and implemented. Refusal to do so, he says, is irreconcilable with the Torah tradition. Rabbi Bernstein urges Jews to get behind H.R. 40, the commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans Act. It is a bill that has been introduced to the U.S. Congress for the past 25 years. Bernstein continues, as Jews, if we take our Torah tradition seriously, we should make it a core issue of Jewish American politics to demand that H.R. 40 be brought to the House floor and passed. We know, he says, that liberation from slavery without reparations is a woefully incomplete liberation. Hilchot Teshuvah, the laws of repentance, include confession, vidui, seeking forgiveness from those we have hurt, and restitutions, returning that which has been lost or suffered. H.R. 40 merely asks that Congress study possible ways to reenact and enact reparations. The loss of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been devastating for the Jewish community and for the country. There's been criticism by some that she focused too much on gender and not enough on race. But according to Irene Camon, co-author of Notorious RBG, she said as important as her women's rights work was her broader commitment to equal justice and civil rights. In 2013, Justice Ginsburg issued a blistering dissent in Shelby County versus Holder, denouncing the court's invalidation of central portions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 on the grounds that they were no longer necessary. Justice Ginsburg said, "It's like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet." In 2003, Yom Kippur fell on October the 6th, the first Monday in October, which is the day that the US Supreme Court begins its session with the hearing of oral arguments. Justice Ginsburg helped change this precedent for future generations, arguing that Yom Kippur is such an important day for the Jewish community and for Jewish lawyers and judges. Indeed, Yom Kippur is a day when we stand before the ultimate judge. How will we be judged? In our willingness to stand up for justice. I worry sometimes that I'm a performative activist in talking a good talk but not doing much to address the inequalities and injustices that are so embedded in our institutions. Congressman John Lewis wrote a letter that was published on the day of his funeral at the end of July. I shared some of it on Rosh Hashanah too. His words empower us and give us hope, but not complacency. Towards the end of the letter, he says, ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful non-violent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed you can lose it. You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I've done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and non-violence is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. When historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide. In memory of the judge and the lawmaker who have left remarkable legacies, let's commit as a community and as individuals to learn, to confess, and to act for justice. Get involved with our Response to Racism Committee. Educate yourself by reading both anti-racist texts and by reading the diverse works of Black authors. Join the Boulder Public Library's One Book, One Boulder discussions on race with authors and local leaders. Attend the USCJ Kol Tzedek Conference on racial justice on November 8th to 10th. Vote. Join the NAACP. Vote. Support Black-owned businesses and organizations. Advocate. Speak out against injustices when you see them. If you are white, use the privilege of your body to stand up for people of color. Take risks because your white body allows you to do so. We easily forget that at least 12 to 15% of our communities are Jews of color who have powerful voices and unique perspectives, and yet who often feel unwelcome and excluded from Jewish life. But on this Day of Atonement, at one-ment, no matter our diverse individual backgrounds, we all stand before God and each other as Jews and as human beings who have sinned, who are repenting, and who are making our confessions. Al chet shechatanu lefanecha, for the sins we have committed before you through our own prejudices, and for the sins we have committed before you through our silent complicity in inequality and injustice, may we be forgiven, and may we work for reconciliation and for change. Amen.